This is a Reforge reaction, and in this video, I'm going to be reacting to Fextra Life's video, God of War Ragnarok or Elden Ring, which is Game of the Year. I have not watched this, so I have no idea what the conclusion is. I'm excited to check it out, though. We might do a couple of videos sort of putting these games against each other. There's a lot of people weighing in. Let's dive right in. Be sure to check out my other reactions if you like this one.
In this video, I want to talk about Game of the Year. A lot of talk has been going around after God of War's release about whether God of War or Elden Ring will win Game of the Year this year. A lot of opinions out there about what people think is the Game of the Year. In this video, I want to talk about why I think Elden Ring edges out God of War for Game of the Year.
Okay, so we're not even 30 seconds in to the video, and he's establishing who he thinks is the winner. So I'm interested to hear him make his case because I don't agree. I think it's the other way around. I think Ragnarok edges out Elden Ring for a variety of reasons. So let's hear him out.
This is my own personal opinion. You are totally welcome to yours. But I kind of want to run you through my thought process on this, on why I think it wins. And I'm not going to go into figures or stats about how many review scores or voter scores each game got. I'm simply going to go into the mechanics and the way these games are made.
I'm glad that that's the approach because in my mind, they're virtually tied with respect to the reception and the reviews and the way that the gaming press has treated them. So that's not really the determiner here at all.
Explain why I think Elden Ring is the better game. So to start it off, let's talk a little bit about Elden Ring and what makes the formula of Elden Ring work. And the first thing I want to talk about with Elden Ring is itemization. The itemization of Elden Ring is the best in any action RPG or open world game I have ever played.
I don't have any disagreement here. I'm already kind of knowing where he might go. He's going to sort of compare this to the items and the UI and the builds and everything in Ragnarok. And Ragnarok has really good systems, but that's not really the primary genre or offering for Ragnarok. So if this is a big comparison or a stark comparison that he makes, I don't know if it's a fair one. So I'm going to hear him out, but I do agree that the builds, the itemization, and all the different things you can come up with in Elden Ring is really unmatched, and it is a truly special open world game.
It doesn't use a random loot system to populate loot. It doesn't use a rarity formula of common, uncommon, rare, epic, legendary that we've seen so many times and we're all tired of getting to see. It has a fixed loot system, and that's spread accordingly throughout the map, which is fantastic. But
that's not fantastic for replayability, but I do get a little tired of the RNG loot systems. Well, I actually don't get tired of them. They actually have their place. It's supposed to be in certain games, and I don't think it belonged in Elden Ring.
What it's done in this game compared to the Souls games is it's added Ashes of War, and it's added the summons, the Spirit Ashes, allowing you to have even more things to find between the spells, the weapons, armor, and talismans. And they're all cleverly placed all over the map. So it drives exploration forward. You want to explore because you never know what you're going to get in these little nooks and crannies of the world. There are obviously other reasons to explore, but in terms of the itemization, you're always finding things that you can use to make your character better. And it really drives you to explore the world of Elden Ring. So what this itemization system has done is it's allowed FromSoftware to create a game that's basically free of guidance. It lets the player explore on their own because they're motivated to do it on their own. They don't need to give them points of interest to go like, hey, there's something over here. You should go check it out, because if you don't, you won't find anything. There's stuff everywhere, and you always get rewarded for finding stuff everywhere. And it really makes players just want to go do it on their own. They don't need any more motivation. I mean, there are story and lore related things that are great to see, and actual things in the landscape that are cool to look at.
I will say that as far as exploratory purpose, Elden Ring is, in my mind, unmatched, only maybe matched by Breath of the Wild. I've always talked about big open world games need to have exploratory purpose. There needs to be that sense of mystery and discovery and reward, and you feel like when you find something, it's this genuine discovery. And I think Elden Ring pulled that off masterfully, and so did Breath of the Wild.
Which a lot of RPGs have as well. But it's compounded with the itemization system. And if you look at something like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for instance, they've taken so much loot out of Assassin's Creed with this latest installment that if they didn't have markers on the map, you'd wander around and you'd hardly find anything, because you hardly find anything even with markers on the map. And at some point, you become demotivated and you would simply stop being interested in exploring. And because a lot of the things that you find in Elden Ring directly enhance your build or your combat experience, you want to go engage in combat more because you want to test out the stuff you got. You want to see how it does
Yeah, that's
because you
true.
like the combat of the game and you want to see it even better. So you go
Mhm.
try out these things in fights.
Yeah, anytime I had an Ashes of War or I upgraded something, I wanted to go see how much it would chunk somebody or hurt them. My favorite thing to do in my no summons run was I would use the square off and just bust their posture. It was my favorite thing to do. I liked to see just how much everybody's posture could be broken to the point that certain enemies that you would think you would never really try that strategy, I forced the issue, and it was really enjoyable. I was able to sort of leverage a play style that often I had people in my chat saying, you can't really fight this boss this way. And fifth or sixth try, I would beat them my way, and it gave me a real sense of pride. Not because I was doing anything particularly challenging, but I was sort of going against the wiki warrior, oh, this is the way to play, this is the way to beat the boss. I wasn't doing that. I was like, no, I'm going to try to make this work. And it was really enjoyable.
And this leads me to my next point, which is that the combat in Elden Ring is the best in gaming. The basic systems are there from Dark Souls, but there's more options in combat with the Ashes of War being added. Now you can change the skills on different weapons, and the affinity system allow you to change the scaling of different weapons. It gives you so many different ways you can play the game. It's nearly endless.
I know where he's going. I'm going to undercut everything he's saying by pointing to the second half of the game. The back half of Elden Ring sharply undercuts all that build diversity and makes certain builds and certain kits really suck. And I know they've tried to fix that, but that can't really necessarily be credited to them. When the game launched, it probably was like, half of a year before certain builds and certain weapons were even viable in some of the endgame fights. Just too slow animation sets that just were not in line with the speed of the game. The second half of the game is very spammy, very fast, and I think that undercuts some of the value he's praising here. The value's there, but I believe the game undercuts a lot of its own value on the back half of it.
I have made about 100 builds for this game, and I guarantee you I can make at least 100 more if I try. There are just so many different ways to play, and you actually want to try different varieties of things to play because the combat is so good. And because you're engaged in combat so frequently in the game, you'll inevitably be led to facing bosses in the game, which are the best in the industry. The boss fights are challenging, they're rewarding. FromSoftware is known for this. It absolutely has phenomenal boss fights, from the music to the ambience and lore to the setting of these fights to the moves that you have to memorize. All FromSoftware games have really, really excelled at this, and Elden Ring is no exception.
They do have amazing boss fights. They also have really bad boss fights in Elden Ring that have been highly criticized by many people, not just me. So if you're going to make the comparison of these fights to the boss fights in God of War Ragnarok, it's a little unfair at some level because the boss fights in Ragnarok have to maintain a certain cinematic value, a certain grandiose nature to them. And I don't think that's necessarily a fair comparison because Elden Ring simply must put you in these crazy, tough, challenging, but also beatable boss fights. And I think they sort of break some of their own rules later in the game and make some of the fights that are just really unenjoyable. So if that's going to be another point of comparison, I'm kind of prepared to say I don't think that's a fair one to say, well, these are better than the boss fights in Ragnarok because they're so different in their purpose and their aim.
And there are so many of them in Elden Ring. It's absolutely insane. And, the really good thing about
they also repeat a lot of the boss fights and repeat a lot of the animation sets, so that's a point away in my mind. That doesn't really happen in Ragnarok. They did an amazing job not repeating bosses.
about these boss fights as well is they are challenging. There is such a lack of challenge in so many games in the industry, or there's artificial difficulty with more health and more damage.
There's artificial difficulty in Elden Ring, I hate to tell you.
FromSoftware has always managed to find a way to make the fights difficult without using artificial difficulty.
I disagree. I think they used so much area of effect spam in the back half of the game. A lot of it felt really artificial. You weren't allowed to get close to the bosses, or the boss would then run away and have tons of agility. I think there was tons of artificial difficulty in the late stages. I also think people have shown the way that some of the animation sets get broken by the bosses, and they break some of their own rules, and they respond to your healing the minute you press the button. A lot of that would be classified as false difficulty. I would put that in that category.
I'd say in the vast majority of cases. So you get to face these really good bosses with, this itemization that you have and this build that you've put together and you've worked on, and you want to test it out against these bosses. So that's just absolutely fantastic the way that works out. And something that's really interesting about all this is that these concepts, one by one, if you just dissected them, sound extremely simple. A lot of games do some of these aspects really well. But when you set them in this huge world on a scale that, many open world games are, but then add multiplayer, cooperative, and PvP on top of it, you've truly created something that inspires other developers and studios to figure out what exactly they did and how they can incorporate that into their game.
And again, I don't think that's a fair point of comparison. Like, if you're going to say, like, hey, this thing had multiplayer, God of War Ragnarok didn't. Again, the purpose and aim of the art has to be considered. Authorial intent, right? The intent of the author. It would be like saying, this book had really great twists and turns and mysteries. Well, if it's a whodunit, you can't really compare that to an action or maybe like a Tom Clancy that isn't really aiming at doing that. I think the difference in intention and aim of the art has to be considered, and multiplayer's not a fair thing to like, oh, we're going to give that notch to Elden Ring, and I guess maybe, I don't know, I'm not putting words in his mouth, I don't know if he's going to take points away and say, well, this is why it edges out Ragnarok.
A lot of games have one or two of these elements, but they don't have all of them, and that's what really makes Elden Ring special, in my opinion. In contrast,
Okay, I want to be fair. It seems like he was saying that this is a very full package. Like, it kind of did all of these things. That's more of what he's saying. He's not necessarily saying, well, God of War doesn't have multiplayer. He's saying Elden Ring did virtually everything you could possibly do in this genre. I think that's a little bit more of a fair way to say it.
You have God of War Ragnarok, which is excellently produced. It's really, really well polished. It's well planned. It's a bit familiar. It has tons of accessibility, allowing you to tailor the experience to your liking.
Let's also talk about how Elden Ring to this day still has issues with frame pacing, and it's still better to play the PS4 version on your PS5 because it's more stable and doesn't have frame hitches and staggers and stutters. We can talk about that. I think that takes points away from Elden Ring, personally.
However, no one is going to make a God of War-like game, and other developers are not going to try to emulate it. So why is that? I think the obvious answer here is because it doesn't deepen or expand the action-adventure genre in any way.
Disagree.
Everything is predictable.
Disagree.
Particularly if you've played other action-adventure games with similar exploration elements like Horizon, Assassin's Creed, Ghost of Tsushima, or the previous God of War game, you know exactly what you're in for. Now, God of War...
Okay, but that could be said for virtually all of the combat in Elden Ring because so much of it was borrowed from, I don't know, every From Software game that came before it. All it added was weapon arts and summons. So you could look at some of the things in Ragnarok and say that's not really been done before. The depth of, I would actually just go to the shield system personally and say, oh, the fact that you have this shield that has, like, I think there's like, I don't know how many total different ones there are, so I don't want to spoil that for anybody, but that really deepens combat. Typically in most games, your shield is either going to do block or parry or like deflection. This deepens all of those possibilities because it's not just a block anymore. It's not just a parry. It's a form of parry and return damage or damage absorption and like shocking it back at them. So that actually, I would say, is on the level of what weapon arts, well, I wouldn't say it's on the level of what weapon arts brought to Elden Ring. But again, I do think it deepened something that was already there. And so they're both doing that. They're both taking what's already there and deepening it because so much, a large portion of the combat in Elden Ring is just borrowed directly from Dark Souls.
War Ragnarok isn't focused on exploration. It's an added bonus. And its true focus is on the story and narrative of the game. And where the story is more engaging and told in a much better manner than Elden Ring, in my opinion, it doesn't make up for the issues God of War has with combat, exploration, and itemization. Unlike Elden Ring, players are not rewarded the same way for exploring, and you often know the exact puzzles you will face as well as the loot you will gain in any given area.
but you know the exact loot in the areas in Elden Ring on your second playthrough. So I actually don't think that's true. I didn't know what was in any of the areas when I was exploring them in God of War Ragnarok. I was just exploring them and finding them. The only thing I started to get clued in on was like if you get Odin's Ravens, there's gear you get from that, and you know it's all going to be from that set once you get like one piece. But that's not true of exploration like at all. I didn't know what I was going to find. I was just wandering around, finding chests, opening them, and getting different loot pieces and different abilities, and then checking what they could do. That's what he just said is not true. I didn't know where any of this stuff was. Nobody told me. And again, in Elden Ring, he literally said it in the video. You know where everything is because it's not RNG. Like, that thing is always there. So on your first playthrough, sure, you don't know. It's always there. But on my first playthrough of Ragnarok, I didn't know what was going to be in any of the areas when I explored them.
There are no surprises that make you feel good for finding them. And you never wonder if other players have found this really cool thing because it's not unique or original, whatever you found.
But that's not true. I have found pieces of armor. I found a piece of armor that I'm using right now, and then I found other pieces of armor that added to it in an indirect way. The one piece of armor I have, it does this thing where it heals under certain conditions, and these other armor pieces increase how much healing I get from different armor pieces. I found those in different places and through different means. And so, yeah, I found something and thought, oh, wow, this is truly special. It's changing my build. And you wouldn't have found some of the stuff that I found if you weren't exploring. If you were playing super linearly and just playing through the game and not looking off the beaten path and behind to things and looking for secrets, then you wouldn't find the things that I've found that have changed the way that I play. I'm actually approaching combat in a very particular way because of the gear that I found.
To compound this, the combat largely follows the same formula of enemies popping out of every place you would expect, and you then have to burst through all your cooldowns to eliminate a numbers advantage, and then R1 or R2 everything to death before repeating. Never really feel.
That's a terrible summary of the combat in God of War Ragnarok. It also is showing some bias. So much of the combat in Elden Ring is super formulaic and super familiar to Dark Souls. Virtually every area I went into felt like I was in a Dark Souls area, and the combat and the move sets of the enemies and the animation sets of the enemies and my animation sets were right from Dark Souls. That's not a slam. Like, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So this is a bit of an unfair critique and criticism, and it's also an unfair summary of the combat. God of War Ragnarok, no spoilers, you end up with a very, very diverse set of things you can use, and those things that you can use each have their own very unique abilities, powers, and things that chained together create bonkers combos. In addition to like your companion Atreus, I don't. It's not a matter of like using cooldowns and then just R1ing something to death. If that's how you're playing the game, I think maybe you're playing it wrong. That's not how combat in this game should go. If you're outfitting yourself correctly. Now, God of War 2018 early gameplay felt that way because you didn't have a lot of abilities. But once you get really decked out in Ragnarok, you should not be R1ing things to death. You should be doing combos to stun, break, or destroy them efficiently. And that you shouldn't be doing that for the bulk of the combat, because very early on I was equipped to really work on a certain playstyle that was excellent. It was lots of stuns, lots of executions, lots of healing through that. That's not a good summary of the combat in this game at all.
Feeling like you're getting any stronger with the best fights in the game saved for after you finish the game.
I can't speak to that. I've not completed the game totally and gone back through, but I have had some amazing fights, very satisfying fights. I think the boss fights are actually where the combat shines. I think the mob fights in Ragnarok can get a little spammy and a little annoying, and I think the boss fights are where everything sort of shines. But again, saying that you don't feel stronger, I'm sorry. That sounds like you didn't really investigate or experiment. You did what worked in the first game. That's kind of your own fault. You can play Ragnarok in a very safe, familiar way, and make it just kind of feel like 2018. Or you can really experiment with switching and swapping and doing all sorts of different things and interlacing them to get combos, and you will feel very strong when you do that efficiently and effectively.
Additionally, there is a loot system in God of War where you find material and craft and upgrade gear, but you almost never feel stronger for doing so, and it doesn't change the way you play the game, so you never feel inspired to go test it out in combat.
That is simply not true. I was actually ready to agree with him. I thought he was going to critique the inventory system and the crafting system. It's all sort of muddled together and muddy. I don't think it's organized particularly well, but you do feel stronger and you do play different. I completely changed my play style when I put on this one piece of armor, and then I changed it again when I added more armor to supplement it. And then I changed my play style again when I changed my shield, and then I changed my play style again when I tried a different shield. This just simply isn't true. Like you, again, it sounds like you didn't do enough experimentation or something. There's a lot of different build opportunities, and there's a lot of different perks and things that interplay with each other. And if you're not feeling the need to go out and test those things out, then I don't know. Maybe you feel like you didn't find cool loot and you found what everybody else found. Maybe you played it too linearly. I don't know. This doesn't sound like the experience I've had at all.
The game most certainly doesn't need this system since it's not an action RPG, but since they have added it, it could be a lot better than it is. What's particularly interesting to me is that Ghost of Tsushima follows a similar formula, just with an open world, that doesn't focus as much on itemization, but the game managed to capture combat and an immersion in a way that made me really feel like a badass samurai. God of War Ragnarok did, just not all that often. There were some spectacular moments where you really felt like the God of War, but a lot of the time on harder difficulties, you feel as though you're just struggling to kill weak enemies, and it's not quite the same as doing it in style like in DMC5.
I will say that Tsushima very much focuses on the 4 stances and then investing in those stances and finessing and mastering the stances within when they're applicable. So it's not about itemization, but that's just not true of Ragnarok. You have I don't want to spoil anything. You have a lot of things at your disposal at the end that properly used, outfitted, and toggled through, you are really strong. You feel awesome. Like I've played on normal, so maybe some of this breaks down to the harder difficulties. I've heard people say that No Mercy is better than Give Me God of War. It's like the sweet spot for the game. I've heard people say that. So
in some ways, God of War Ragnarok reminds me of a Marvel movie. It's a movie that when you walk into the movie theater, you know exactly what you're going to expect. You're going to expect great visuals, a lot of special effects, phenomenal voice acting, recognizable characters and actors from other movies that are very famous. And you're probably going to walk out of the movie theater having had a great time, and so will everyone that went with you as well.
That's so reductionist. This game is a cinematic masterpiece within the gaming world. There's nothing on its level. And to sort of be like, yeah, it's just kind of going into a Marvel movie, you know what to expect. No. There were so many good twists and turns. There's so many great characters. The voice acting and the writing and the way the story plays out. This game's unmatched right now. There's no video game that tells a story cinematically that is on the level of Ragnarok. That's just that's reducing it to such a simplistic way of looking at it. I don't think that's fair at all to what they poured into this game.
And a couple years after that, there'll be another Marvel movie, which will follow the same pattern, great special effects, good voice acting, good production value that you'll enjoy. And a couple years after that, there'll be another one because Marvel has the system down. They know how to make a movie that will sell, that people will go see, that's a good experience, and people will keep coming back. But they will never push for anything better than that.
Love and Thunder has entered the chat. I'm sorry, Marvel's lost some of its flavor. They've lost some of the appeal, and you can see it in the response from the consumers. Ragnarok is not that. It is a step up from 2018. It's a step up for cinematically narrative story-driven games. Like, Marvel has actually failed to continue to deliver greatness. They've started to become predictable and mediocre, and it's hurting them. Ragnarok is not comparable to what Marvel has done with their property. I mean, again, look at Love and Thunder and the way people responded to it. I loved Thor. Funny enough, Ragnarok, funny coincidence. I loved it. And then Love and Thunder was just weak.
And they don't need to. They absolutely don't have to. But Marvel movies are never going to win Best Movie of the Year at the Oscars. They're never going to win that. It's just not a thing. You several years from now, you won't even remember the stories of the Marvel movies. They're not.
That's a very subtle way, again, of reducing God of War to something that like shouldn't win Game of the Year. Yeah, well, 2018 did, so that's a bit of a checkmate, I believe.
Not, that memorable. The experience you'll remember. You remember you had a good experience, but nothing will stand out at you as being amazing.
But God of War 2018 did just that and won Game of the Year.
In some ways, I feel like Sony is doing a similar thing with their first party titles where they've figured out the formula and they are just cranking out these titles that follow that formula, and they're always hitting about that 9 mark-ish in terms of review scores, but they're never trying to innovate or push past that point because they don't need to. Whether they win Game of the Year or don't win Game of the Year, it doesn't matter to them because their sales are always good, where I feel like From Software took a much bigger risk with Elden Ring, and it's continuing to innovate on the genre and their gameplay.
I will say that I agree Elden Ring was a bigger gamble. They really abandoned their formula, but it's extremely unfair to say that after Dark Souls 1 and 2 and 3 and Bloodborne and Sekiro, and they did all of that before they did Elden Ring and went into open world. Like, God of War 2018 is the only game like that for Santa Monica and for the God of War franchise. So to do a sequel and to not completely reinvent it and innovate is sensible. Like, again, that's an unfair comparison. Now, if we were playing right now God of War Ragnarok, and this was like the 6th version in this lane and the combat was very much like this, everything, then you could say that. But truly, Elden Ring borrowed so much from Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and Sekiro, and Bloodborne. Just doing it in an open world, you're acting like they just completely reinvented their game when so much of it was just baked in movesets, combat sets, and animation sets from Dark Souls. And listen, I loved Elden Ring. I praised it. I also criticized it. I continue to say that it was the Game of the Year contender until Ragnarok came out. We didn't really know. And I continue to say it was Elden Ring's year to lose. You know, I continue to say that. And I would defend it against a lot of people saying, oh, it's just open world Dark Souls. So I'm not trying to say that, but you have to be honest about the fact that, like, it isn't fair to look at the history of FromSoft games like, well, look what they did with Elden Ring. Yeah, and look how long it took to get there. There's only one God of War before Ragnarok that's like this. The one. Sony's dialing in the formula. No, they're not. Like, the devs are making games that are hits, and then they're following them up. Like, I'm sure Spider-Man 2 is going to be very similar to the previous Spider-Man. But if you really break them down and compare them, God of War and Spider-Man are only similar in a couple of things on paper. Everything else experientially is totally different.
In conclusion, what you think Game of the Year is largely depends on how much weight you put into the story, graphics, and superb voice acting of God of War Ragnarok.
Agreed, because Elden Ring has a virtually non-existent story and narrative and voice acting. And unless you're a sleuth or a wiki warrior, you don't really know what's going on in Elden Ring.
If those are the most important qualities for you in a game, then this will easily win Game of the Year award for you.
They're not the most important, but I believe that God of War gets to put notches on its belt that Elden Ring doesn't. And the only thing that Elden Ring can really put on its belt that God of War Ragnarok can't, God of War Ragnarok gets to do it a little bit. It's like an open world light game. So that's like really the only thing. And I don't think that the open world experience in Elden Ring is strong enough to override all of the other problems that it had, to override all of the other criticisms that it's had. And also, it's not even a next-gen title. We have to start to consider that, I think, in Game of the Year rankings. Like, God of War Ragnarok is one of the most beautiful games I've ever played. It's a truly next-gen game. We can't keep ignoring that. Games that set out and do those harder things and make those harder choices to make their game look beautiful. Elden Ring did virtually nothing in that department, and it launched with significant performance issues, and some of them still have not been resolved. It's just like when Returnal, didn't win Game of the Year, and it was one of the few actual next-gen games in the running. I think that has to be taken into consideration. It's not just about the story. I feel it's a little unfair to act like, well, God of War Ragnarok really only wins if you just look at the story. There's plenty of other reasons and other things to look at.
If you have our favorite gameplay, exploration, customization, itemization, and combat like me, then Elden Ring is hands down the Game of the Year. Either way, they are both fantastic games, and you should definitely play them both.
Agreed.
So what are your guys' thoughts? Am I completely off here? I tried to stay away from sales numbers or what.
I'm going to stop there. I actually think that he approached it in a really fair way and owned his bias at the end. He's basically saying, listen, this is what I prize, and this game did these things better. I think that's a fundamental failure, though, to define Game of the Year. I don't think we define Game of the Year by like, well, what do I think the most important things are? I think we say, what was the most complete package? And in 2022, I think the cinematic strength, the next-gen quality, and the holistic game that Ragnarok is, I think, the reason it wins Game of the Year over Elden Ring. And if you're going to start to try to take points away from like, oh, it has similar combat to 2018, well, how much of Elden Ring is Dark Souls, right? Oh, it only lets you do so many things with the open world. Okay, well, Elden Ring's open world really hurts its replayability, according to many people in the community. So certain things looked at certain ways aren't necessarily pros and cons. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but I wanted to be fair and sort of try to, if I felt myself disagreeing, I wanted to disagree in a fair way because I like Fextra Life's content. So be sure to check out the original video. It's linked below in the description. Check out my other reactions. Check out Reforge Gaming. It's where I stream live. Thanks so much for watching this video here. Hit subscribe and the bell button, and I'll see you in the next Reforge reaction.